We have been talking quite a bit about the need for effective dialogues, effective consultations, and a lot of that goes to how we develop coalitions, across organizations, coalitions with the public, a coalition of a movement. And one of the ideas planted this morning was the idea of, do we need kind of a structured stratcom dialogue around these issues? So this panel goes to the heart of that by looking at how do we build multi-sectoral coalitions? And we deliberately chose panelists from a wide range of different backgrounds to bring forward different types of models to draw on. So it draws on recent efforts to build alignment across movements, sectors, cultural contexts, and the key questions here: what makes collaboration possible? What gets in the way? And where are the needs or openings today? So we asked to moderate this panel Michael Khoo, who's the co-founder of UpShift Strategies, and he's also the co-chair of the Climate Action Against Disinformation. So we did already have a chance to speak to that coalition this morning in the panel about fractured narratives. This will be more about how does that coalition function. The panelists are Dave McMahon, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Clairvoyance. He's also an associate with the Information Integrity Lab. David Scales is the Assistant Professor at Weill Cornell Medicine's done a lot of great work in public health. And then Juhi is co-founder of Imagining and Otherwise. So Michael, as moderator, the Info Lab, has also gained much from your wisdom as part of the climate action against disinformation. So as well as moderating this panel, it'd be great if you just took a few minutes to explain how did your coalition come to be? What are the kinds of best practices or lessons learned for others? And then invite you to moderate the panel to bring the same out from your panelists.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me and Phil here. It means the world for us living in the States to come up here and feel safer doing this work than we normally do, where we're fending off lawsuits from powerful, rich people and the weight of the U.S. government. So I think I'd sort of start by saying that we approached building our coalition based out of the power analysis that everybody talked about this morning. We are going up against people who are spending hundreds of millions a year against us. We know, we have the statistics that Phil showed and others, that there is climate support for climate science, support for climate action. But why is that not happening? It's because their side has more power that they're using opaquely against us. So we did a couple of things in our early days. 4 examples I'll just run through of what helped us really understand intersectionality in a non-performative sense, because I'm sure we all see it being thrown around as some term. One of the first things we did was hire Graphica, which is a network research firm, to take the Desmog blog climate denier database, which is like a list of registered people paid by fossil fuel companies to lie about climate information. And we put a circle around them in the network analysis and watched as they morphed from being one group of just straight climate deniers to then moving on to being anti-maskers as soon as COVID hit. And then 2 months later became anti-BLM conspiracists. And then 2 months later became misogynists against Kamala Harris. So we saw that this one group that we thought had one identity, in fact, had multiple identities because they were opportunistic. And that was the first sort of very obvious time why we had to become intersectional, because all of our goals were really the same as all those other movements. And we found that, especially in the fight for LGBT rights, that and some of the research that's come out, both from Desmog and other stuff that we've helped with, and Amy Westerveld at Drilled has done a great special on, is the amount of money behind the transphobia in the United States is so explicitly tied to the fossil fuel interests. So the fight for the transparency we want to show why it's a small group of people who are flooding the zone, that's the same fight for climate change as it is for the fight to protect trans youth. So that's sort of our first major thing that we saw. And then secondly, to be more giving from our movement is in learning about the tech policies that we needed, especially of transparency as a first measure, that we needed to get off our chairs and actually go help others. So there was a bill called the Digital Services and Oversight Act, which is like the U.S. equivalent of the European Digital Services Act. And we got 16 environmental groups to sign on, co-sponsor a bill that did not say the word climate or environment. And that was like a huge achievement for us 2 years in to say, like, we are getting people to realize that tech policy is everyone's policy. And if we don't fix the information environment, we're not going to have any environment. And that we also we need to be there for other people before you can really ask them to be there for you. And then the last one I'll end with is the Stop Toxic Twitter campaign. So in April, before Musk bought the platform, we and one other environmental group and then 14 other progressive groups signed a letter to advertisers saying, if he takes over the platform, uphold the community standards that you've had, your privately developed community standards by which you get advertising. Uphold those because it's probably going to go poorly. We sent that letter, and then one of our groups in our coalition, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, did the monitoring to find out in the first few days of the takeover that the rise of the use of the N-word went up 500%. And that, we were very proud to see, led to the flood of advertisers departing the platform and cost them $50 billion that year. Obviously, it's taken many turns since then, and including multiple lawsuits that are costing groups in our coalition tens of millions of dollars in order to fight. But we were all there from the beginning to throw the rocks, and we're all there at the end to be there for each other as we're going through the arguably much harder times in those campaigns. So that's just a few stories of how we were, naturally led into the intersectionality of building the movement, because we knew we couldn't do it alone. We knew that there was great things that we could do together, and that obviously the people that we are facing, the adversaries, are interlinked in a way that we're not, and they're certainly vastly out-resourcing us. So that's CAD's story, but I will move on next to our amazing panelists who have individual stories from different sectors that I think hopefully we'll see a lot of overlap. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Dave McMahon, and I'm going to try to just sort of bring some insight in terms of what I've learned from some other coalitions. I've seemed to make a career out of coalitions, whether the military coalitions, intelligence, defense, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure protection, public-private partnerships, and they all have very strong lessons, maybe a little further ahead than the Disinformation Coalition. So you can essentially use a lot of their playbooks to fast-track where you want to be in a very short period of time. We started looking at, I say we in terms of I was involved in the Canadian government at the time, I would say information warfare and disinformation operations in the 1990s. We had a pretty good strategy, and then we got sort of blindsided by this thing called cyberspace. So that took a front row seat for a couple of decades. And I think a lot of what we learned going through that very painful process of developing coalitions and partnerships and things like that can be uniquely, or can be very quickly applied to your particular case. So just go over a few things. One is, I think it's very hard to pull apart disinformation from online disinformation from cyber. The two are pretty much lock and step. Cyber information or cyber attacks are predominantly, the cyber vector is through disinformation, deception, social engineering, and vice versa. Most of the online disinformation operations require cyber infrastructure to maintain and amplify and sustain. Also, the same actors are involved in both. So there's good lessons there and good correlation, as well as reaching out to those particular groups. In fact, to your point, and we've noticed it as well, every disinformation investigation I've been involved in has necessarily led to things like military operations, espionage, political intrigue, criminal elements, extremism, and all the way to child safety issues very, very quickly. And so we tend to cross mandates, domains, types of investigations, and groups, user groups, and victim groups in the same investigation at the speed of light. So that's why really important. And as you mentioned before, it's very quickly for an actor to pivot from climate disinformation to homophobia to generating deepfakes that are targeting women. So we need to be able to move very agilely through those sorts of space across those things. It's also important to understand that disinformation is uniquely discoverable through open source intelligence methods, and it's uniquely countered through open methods and open and transparent coalitions. And that's very important because it means private sector, non-government agencies, civil society take a leadership role in that, supported by industry and supported by government. But in order to break that down, we need to break down the compartmentalization and some of the walled gardens that we built around these disciplines that tend to be a victim of their own, I would say, industrialization for efficiency's sake. They tend not to look beyond their borders, and so we need to break those down with certain trust and sharing of information. I would say trusted partnerships is key. Trust being the operative word. And this is like sharing knowledge, ideation, orchestrating real solutions together, and engaging in deconfliction on where necessary, correlation and deconfliction. With all the stuff that's been written, in particular, let's say I'll just take cybersecurity and cybersecurity coalitions and multi-stakeholder engagement, you could almost just change the word cyber and replace it for disinformation, and you pretty much have yourself a playbook to move forward. A lot needs to be rewritten in those sort of spaces. And I'll just say, when it comes to climate change disinformation, that I think that represents the vital high ground. If you solve for climate change disinformation, you solve for a lot of disinformation challenges, as we sort of mentioned. That essentially be where the most money is being waged on both sides of this equation, and where foreign powers and large industrial complexes are also involved. So that I see as the big battleground for truth, the war against science. Thank you very much.
Hi. I am so intrigued by all of these experiences that you're all sharing, and I kind of wanted to zoom in a little bit and talk from the perspective of having been a canvasser and organizer, and then having landed in a lot of coalitions. How many of you have been a representative of an organization or of a group, or have just been part of a coalition? If I could see hands. How many of you have seen that coalition fall apart because of internal dynamics? So many hands. I think that if we can all kind of think back to a conversation that you have had, either as a canvasser or someone who has had a difficult uncle to talk to, or somebody with whom you know you share values, and you know there is some political alignment deep down inside, but just at the surface, we are all using this different language. And it's a language that we really have to wade through. That same principle of having to kind of translate how we speak to different people, it applies in coalition. And building these broad coalitions across sectors, it does allow us to leverage a unique form of power. There are some people here who I'm sure are familiar with the 4 forms of power: power over, power with, power to do something, and power within. Seeing some nods. The power with is one that we are living in a society that is actively trying to dismantle that. And that collective power is something, us identifying the charities that can help us, the foundations that are aligned with us, the grassroots groups that are doing mutual aid on the ground, emergency, like disaster preparedness, which we are seeing a lot of people doing, and a lot of the people that are organizing these Facebook groups for wildfire preparedness, they're not people who see themselves reflected in a lot of our coalition spaces, nor do they see themselves reflected in other types of mutual aid spaces. Some of these are rural people, people who are living near or under the poverty line, and are doing this out of need and also out of a desire to experience interdependence again. And I think that those are the values that we tend to not really see, again, like I said, reflected back in our coalition spaces. So I'm thinking a little bit from the lens of broad coalition for long-term power building. How many of you have been in a coalition space that fell apart but then saw the same people show up in a different coalition space? How can we write the longer novel and not just a chapter, right? We are all, like Michael said, we are all writing the same story at the end of the day. And so how do we find that thesis statement and how do we pull it through? And a lot of the problems that we have that are actually directly and indirectly related to climate disinformation and misinformation at their root are problems of affordability, of housing, of healthcare, and people are worried about their families and people are worried about their kids. And so how do we pull in a unique and very unusual group of stakeholders into coalition? And then how do we examine ourselves and our relationship to the work that we're doing? I think it was Kat who was talking about how, Kat and Zoe were talking about how this is deeply relational work at its core. There are so many people here who are going to go back to a coalition space probably, and they're like, there's this one person who's really dominating the conversation. Or there's a funder who doesn't really get what we're doing, and how do we explain it to them? Or we just have to get the deliverable met. How do we go back and think about the fact that each of these goals is actually just a milestone, and these coalitions are built to last forever? I'm hoping that we can actually, in this group today, talk a little bit about how democracy is at stake, and the role of coalition in all of this is actually in an exercise in reintroducing authenticity into these spaces. Because truth is in recession. Somebody was saying that like the currency of truth, has definitely gone down in value. But emotions are at an all-time high. And emotion is really, I think, what we should be talking and thinking about in coalition a lot of the time. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about meeting people's basic needs. And so in these coalitions, how are we talking about, at the end of the day, what this coalition is gathered to do is a milestone in this broader pursuit of justice, in this broader pursuit of coming together to intervene in democracy, right? I think it's a very powerful intervention in democracy for us to have these unusual coalitions with whom we actually don't agree with everybody, and to have that healthy dialogue and to practice accountability as care. And I think that one of the most interesting things that I got to see a couple years ago was locally in Montreal, there were a group of Indigenous organizers, migrant rights organizers, transit advocates, climate justice organizers, ecological grief circles. We saw people from all over the place coming together to demand for climate justice with social justice. People are already thinking through this lens. I was talking to someone from Les Connecteurs earlier today, and we were talking about how identity politics had really, I think that we were all looking through the lens of identity politics over the last 10 years, and there's a reason for that. I think that like the disinformation and misinformation powers that be actually did stoke those flames, but I think that we're at a point now where people are experiencing the pocketbook pain. People are starting to understand that there are corporate powers now that are intervening in our democracy, and our coalitions need to be anchored around this shared understanding that every small group that we make is actually part of a bigger group that has to be built to last. So every goal that we meet in coalition is a milestone toward accountability and toward regulation, hopefully, of those corporate powers that have started to really take control of our democracy. And the final thing that I want to say is seeing that lens of all of those Montreal-based organizers coming together. It was really interesting because there was a lot of disagreement, of course. We see that all the time. However, what was really beautiful that came out of it was that through the disagreement, everybody realized that what we actually need is something very different, and they put together a document, and they started to take that around to get funding, to get people to understand what they were actually trying to do, and now that has actually built really deep and wonderful relationships. And those relationships have enabled people to share food, time, money, and resources. That's the interdependence that we don't actually get to experience anymore. But when people do get to access that again, they get to see that we do have much more power in the collective, and that was a coalition space that seeded that. So I'm just thinking a little bit about the broader impacts of coalition spaces in general, and then also how we monitor and evaluate our progress. And sometimes the evaluation is just that maybe we were setting far too short-term a goal this entire time. And maybe it's really about the culture change at the grassroots, and again, like I said, accountability as care. If you care about something, you will push for it to be better. And so how do we do that deep culture work, interpersonally? Why are we doing the work that we're doing even? Right? Why do I care so much about the climate? Yes, of course, I want to see future generations live and thrive and survive. I love the trees that line my neighborhood in the Plateau in Montreal. I love all of these things, but at the end of the day, it's because we have ceased to experience the interconnectedness, and coalition spaces are such a powerful place for us to reintroduce and also to democratize and also to just talk shit, honestly. Like, we really need to desanitize the ways in which we show up in these spaces, and allow for them to seed that more authentic relationship building outside of the spaces as well, because we're all bringing networks into these things. So I'm very curious to hear what you're about to talk about. And I'm really grateful for you two for sharing, because I genuinely think that these, our approaches are really complementary. And so I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about how we're going to talk about accountability and about identity and actually creating welcoming spaces. So thank you.
That's great. Some excellent discussions, tough acts to follow. I'm basically going to talk about making essentially a pitch to collaborate with folks in health. And what I hope is in the discussion, I can elaborate a little bit more on some of my experiences with it. But I'm going to talk essentially about three things that might sound a little strange at this discussion, but I'm going to talk about addiction, I'm going to talk about frameworks, and then I'm going to talk about language. And hopefully kind of play a little bit on some of what you were discussing, Juhi. So addiction. So about a year ago, the New York Times, I'm from the United States, I work in New York City for the most part. The New York Times published an article about disinformation and disinformation researchers, and it said basically the headline, "Disinformation researchers don't even know how to fight it." Which might be a little bit of a surprise for folks at this conference, as it was for me, because I think there's actually a number of techniques that people use to kind of combat disinformation. One of them is already discussed at this conference, inoculation, which is essentially a medical metaphor that comes from medicine. So I'd like to acknowledge that we already have one thing, idea that comes from medicine that is, from the 1960s. Inoculation was first kind of mentioned as a possible cure for brainwashing. But I'd also like to bring up what was also already brought up at the conference today by Marie-Ève Carignan about motivational interviewing. Because it's something that I think a lot of people in this room may not have heard of, but I really want to stress just how important it is. Because motivational interviewing, for example, I'm not going to say it's the Holy Grail. I want to be very clear. This is just one piece of the puzzle, but using this as an example for kind of why collaboration with health can be very useful. When we talk about interventions to address mis or disinformation, there's a lot of interventions that we could talk about that change attitudes or behaviors, or attitudes or beliefs. But there's very few that change behaviors. Motivational interviewing has been shown to do that in randomized controlled trials, province-wide in Quebec and in some studies across Canada. So when we think about this, it's like, wow, this is actually a very powerful tool to combat mis and disinformation. You probably haven't found it because in the papers by Arnaud Diagnard, who's at University of Sherbrooke, he doesn't use the word misinformation. He's talking specifically about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. So if you're focused on mis or disinformation, you're doing a systematic review or meta-analysis, you've probably missed that. But motivational interviewing is also really important for another reason, and that's what relates to addiction. So motivational interviewing, the history of it, it's about 40 years ago. It was developed inductively by working with people with addiction and recognizing that if you shame them, if you do things that kind of combat them directly, you get backfire effects. And so they actually realized, some of the people that were developing this, of like, what is a non-confrontational counseling method that we can use to engage people who, and listen very closely to this, whose behaviors are not commensurate with their goals. So in the case of addiction, it's someone's health behaviors not commensurate with their health goals. This is me as a practicing physician when I'm admitting someone to the hospital who drinks a gallon of vodka a day, who says, this is destroying my life, doc. I'm losing my family, I'm losing my friends, I'm losing my job, I don't have any money, I'm losing my home, I can't quit. His health goals are to stay healthy. But what is he doing? He's drinking a gallon of vodka a day. Right? So when someone's health behaviors are not commensurate with their health goals, it is my job, it is my lane to have a conversation with them. And I use motivational interviewing to do that. So, and there's other techniques out there as well. So I just want to kind of bring this into what Sonia Solomon mentioned this morning about how there are structural barriers to democratic decision-making. And when we think about democratic decision-making where voters' behaviors do not match their long-term goals, I think we need to be thinking more about the paradigm of addiction and how we can be bringing in some of the additional characteristics of how health professionals work with people with addiction, both at individual and population levels, thinking about things like harm reduction. So, but addiction is not the only thing. When we think about other frameworks, this is my second point, is that we use the terms information ecosystems, information environments. So in health, we can help a lot of the folks here that work in kind of environmental spaces. In health, we also work with environmental health. So trying to move beyond just this idea of information environments as a metaphor, but almost as a model. Because when we think about environmental health changes the way that we approach things, because a tenet of environmental health is that the dose makes the poison. Water in too much of a dose is poisonous. I admit people to the hospital all the time because they drank too much water. So when we think about information, we could think about it the same way. And if we turn the environmental health lens on it, it changes the way we think about it. We think about the route at which someone is absorbing something. Is this by video or is this by print? We think about the duration at which in which they're exposed to it, the frequency. We think about all of these factors. And when we think about this in the environmental health lens, we think about something like lead, right? I don't care what the prevalence of lead is in this world, because lead is ubiquitous. What I care about, because we know enough about how lead causes harm, is lead in certain places where it puts those who are most vulnerable at the greatest risk for negative outcomes. So if we start thinking about misinformation and disinformation in the same way, it's ubiquitous, right? It's not a question of detecting it or what's the prevalence. It's a question of where are the spaces where the most vulnerable are getting most affected by it. So additionally, there's a lot of paradigms from health that I think are really important, but I want to take one last point, and that's on language. So when we think about language, I think language is really important because we have to have a shared language to be able to kind of, have the same concepts. It's not just having a shared sense of the concepts. Because I want to highlight something that's very important as in the United States, people are starting to change the language that they use when they apply to grants. We're starting to see shifting language, somewhat necessarily because of political pressure that's pushed on it. And this happened as well in about 2016 when there was a switch in focus around fake news. But so there's a great paper by a McGill University researcher, Peter McMahon, and his colleague, Jeremy Evans, called Ambiguity and Engagement. And don't feel bad if you haven't found this paper. It's in a sociology journal, and it is the name is as ambiguous as it says. But it's an extremely important paper for this work because what it essentially talks about is, and it looks across scientific fields. It's a very long paper. It was a top journal in sociology. It's a very deep paper, 54 pages. What they found was across a lot of scientific disciplines, science struggles to advance, to really make advancements, unless there is actually shared language and definitions. And that makes sense, right? Because I know the work that I do. I've reviewed a number of kind of papers on mis or disinformation and interventions on mis or disinformation that are systematic reviews and meta-analyses. But it's really tough to compare apples to apples if the definitions aren't the same. So I kind of urge this as a call that even though we're kind of trying to kind of meet across disciplines, we really need to find ways to be using shared language to actually be building on the science. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions.
Excellent stories. Thank you so much. I do want to try and get to questions sooner rather than later, so I had a long slate of questions I emailed you all that I'll probably shorten to one. And I think this is to try and be positive about this, because I think we all know the coalitions that blew up in our face and don't want to belabor that. But, for each of you, what are the best benefits from being in a coalition? And are there any greatest moments that you've ever had from being in a coalition?
Happy to take the first one. What I find kind of working in cross-disciplinary coalitions, I'm also a sociologist, so I kind of sit in this kind of space where I'm not really a doctor, but I'm not really a sociologist. I'm kind of a little bit of both. Is what I find is super helpful is those eureka moments of where you just are having a discussion with someone who's in a field that's completely different than yours, and you actually start to have this almost mind meld that is this emergence of this idea that oh my goodness, we never would have gotten here if we stayed within our own fields. And I think this has come out in a number of different things when it's, for example, some of the discussions that I've had with my colleagues that has really brought out the connection between kind of people who have gone down the rabbit hole of misinformation and addiction. And I think when I didn't come up with that idea, when I've had conversations with colleagues that kind of really described this, and we kind of had this mind meld, it was like, oh my goodness, there's a lot more parallels here than we thought.
Juhi?
You stole my answer, so. No, but truly, I think that it is that experience of having had the opportunity to grow your politics together, to grow your political consciousness, to grow your political analysis with people who understand fundamentally the frameworks in which you're operating, but their application is so different that you have these opportunities to identify pain points that at the end of the day you realize are actually the same ones. And I actually had a very special opportunity to have a discussion in a coalition space with folks from across different sectors who we were talking about this moment of, this revitalized momentum, I guess, or attachment to the idea of Canadian sovereignty that a lot of people have been talking about. And it's so fraught because there are so many of us, myself included, that don't necessarily even believe in the idea of a nation state, but then at the same time feel so deeply connected to an idea of home and the idea of Canada being home. There are a lot of migrant folks who come here, including many folks from my family, who came and feel indebted to the idea of Canada. And then there are Indigenous folks on whose land we are currently living and playing without consent. And so there was this opportunity for all of us to have a discussion about messaging and about narrative in a really unique way where we were all actually disagreeing. And it was the best conversation I have had in years. Like, I got to learn something, and then I got to walk away being like, yeah, okay, like I don't really feel that. If you're saying that Canada feels like home, I would say Montreal feels like home. I would say that my neighborhood feels like home. I don't necessarily myself feel like Canada feels like home, but I see that it does for you. And we here are realizing that we're really just talking about protecting home. And to have gotten there from such a diversity of perspectives, I think could only have existed in a coalition space in which we had all had this agreement to be like, we're not going to punish each other or penalize each other for just growing. So I think that was very, very special. That was my benefit to a coalition space.
Love it, Dave.
Sure. I think the first time it really hit home was I was working at Bell Canada. I was responsible for complex programs, and we're trying to model the internet. And the internet is one of those first things man and woman built that we don't really understand how it works. But we're trying to we borrow from other sciences. So we're borrowing from neuroscience in terms of the world brain, ecology. In terms of and evolution. So these were concepts that we were able to apply to those systems. But in order to do that, we had to reach out to experts in those fields, and we're not speaking the same language, but we could find some common ontology to sort of get those ideas from other people and then apply them to our own field. And we started doing that. We started developing empathy. Like, how does the other person feel? How do they think? How do people operate within that discipline? What is their worldview? And as soon as we started to do that, we started to identify critical interdependencies between large-scale infrastructures and peoples and things like that, people, process, and technology. And when we started doing that, we started then realize there's emergent effects. When two things come together, something extraordinary happens on it, whether synergies or whatever. When it comes to things like disinformation and some of the investigations we're working on and everything, it very quickly things turn up in very unexpected places. For example, we're starting looking at, let's say, climate change disinformation. We go to the Arctic. We hit on Indigenous issues in there. Then we say, well, what about genderized Indigenous disinformation issues? Is there something special or different than that? Well, there is. In the way that, let's say, a genderized disinformation campaign is mounted, inevitably involves more deep fakes, which also lend to the porn industry and things like that. You never would have got there alone. You need the guidance within a coalition. The people guide you from your discipline to the next discipline, and then work those things in the middle. And that's the hardest part, is actually understanding empathy, the dependencies, and the other person's point of view, their other aspects. And I think once we get there, then we're able to move forward. Thanks.
That's great. And just to build on that, I had mentioned before our intersectional work on gender issues. And I think we saw this, in the fight being alongside abortion providers. And when you're fighting against big tech, and Google is then allowing Google Maps to be used to target people outside of reproductive health clinics. So that was, again, just plus one, the benefits of things that you don't see unless you're standing really close to someone and actually being open to what they're doing. I guess my favorite moment in our organizing, when Phil and I have been working on this since 2018, when it was just a couple of people doing it off the side of their desk, and we had hadn't fundraised anything for it. And what we sort of discovered over the first year is that most people were lying to their bosses, which was about their job description, what they were doing. They were sort of coming to our meetings secretly because they had also had this aha moment. They're like, oh, actually, I do have to care about tech policy, but my boss thinks I do climate policy, so I'm just not going to tell him that part of it, and I'm going to attend these meetings. And we just thought that was sort of like one person, the next person. It turns out like half the people were having to lie to their bosses about what they were doing. And that became like a point of pride. It's like, well, that is actually the evidence that you were stepping outside of your lane, is that you have to, that you have to stretch the boundaries. So you have to become a tech policy expert as much as you can to understand how your climate policy is going to be affected. And so that has continually happened again and again. It happens at every level. When we would meet with Congress, members of Congress, their staffers, the tech person would tell us to go talk to the climate person. The climate person said, I don't do tech policy. And so you try and collar them both and like put them in the same room. But just knowing that that's both our aha moment and our moment of vulnerability to step over, that was a really magical moment for our growth. So we have very little time left, 6 minutes. I think I'd like to open it up for questions first, and hopefully we can get some of our other stories out in answering towards those. So I think you might have some. Jump here.
Thank you. It's not so much of a question, but a comment, and for which I'd love your input, because I've heard this morning, and again from you, Mr. Scales, the mention of motivational interviewing, and then you mentioning about a shared and common language. And something that kept coming back in my mind, and I hope it'll make sense, is in environmental sectors at least, there's also this notion of deep canvassing, where you'll go, trying to have the conversation and engage with your constituency to not shame them, but really see how we can find common ground and maybe shift them to think differently. And it struck me as like, well, okay, maybe in a different sector, they're using motivational interviewing and we're not speaking the common language. So how can we actually cross-pollinate and think differently about something that we're actually doing in a very similar manner? So I was just putting it out there. Would also love some reaction as well.
Yeah, I got a very quick one, and I'll take it sort of a step differently. Is that in the sales process, when we were trying to sell cybersecurity, we started with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and we found that really fell flat. And then we said, okay, with big stick regulations, standards, things like that, not so much. We turned that around and we said, okay, how do we map this to a business enabler and prosperity for your business? We led with that, and then sales went up. We were able to actually convince businesses that, they need to invest in this sort of thing because of all the good reasons. And we also framed the way we looked at it. In this case, we're talking about this, instead of disinformation, we called it information integrity. It's not good for your business, and reason why it's good. And then if that didn't work, we then said, okay, well, you have some regulatory risks and pressures. Get their lawyers on board. And if that didn't work, then it was a fear, uncertainty, and doubt and the threat after that. But I think we need to turn that framing of the question and really into being very positive. Otherwise, you just get stonewalled immediately, and it's just not going to be a good sale.
This is actually going to be a little bit also tagging on to JP's question for you, is in the motivational interviewing, I think that having had experience working with deep canvassers and just being around that, which has been kind of like a tactic that's had growing popularity, I'm curious about in the motivational interviewing, is there ever, as part of your planning, are you also talking about what that person will do next? Because I think with deep canvassing, the difficult thing that I find is you meld their mushy brains and they agree with you and you're like, okay, we have found this shared language, we have the same foundation. But then where are we putting them? And that's the role, I think, of coalition. Someone in the coalition needs to have an ask and a place for a home for these people so that we're actually continuing to build power. But I'm wondering, in your experience using the motivational interviewing language, is that something that you have had a similar experience of?
Absolutely. So, and just to be clear, one thing I would say is there are times to use different language. I think deep canvassing is fantastic, and I think it's an excellent manifestation of taking the concepts of motivational interviewing out into a different space. And I also want to be clear that I'm not saying that everyone should go do training in motivational interviewing and go use that on your neighbors or kind of, at Thanksgiving. And part of that is because motivational interviewing, when you look at there's a motivational interviewing network of trainers, MINT, and they have very kind of key standards and kind of professional protocols and ethics around when to use motivational interviewing. Sitting next to someone on a plane, not the time to use motivational interviewing. And maybe the best time to maybe. But I think what's key about that, so in motivational interviewing, kind of in its purest form, there's this idea that there's stages. So in Arnaud Gagnour's work, he actually, there's a very clear protocol, which is people that are what's called pre-contemplative. The people who are so far down the rabbit hole that like just having a conversation with them is not going to convince them, don't engage. There's a different approach to them. It's the people who are contemplative or planning. And so that's a recognition that there's kind of potential stages of behavioral change. And the step one in motivational interviewing is somewhat diagnosing where someone is and then responding appropriately. And I don't know if deep canvassing has something similar, but it's when I think about motivational interviewing, I think it's more kind of the concepts and the principles. But then if you move it outside of that space, it might need a different name. There's, for example, empathic refutational interview, which is one that's often used. I also think there's increasingly AI is sometimes talking about using motivational interviewing, and I don't think AI can do motivational interviewing, in my personal opinion. We could call it something else. It can draw principles from it. But so it's recognizing that we need to have a shared language, but when we do kind of move something out of the space and like there's different kind of parameters and ethics and professional standards, it might actually be benefit from a different name. That's my opinion.
Thank you. And I do love the common theme of listening being at the heart of ever connecting with other people, the purpose of the coalition. I think we have some questions in person, not online.
I'm curious to know what you think the role of government might be in supporting coalitions through an arm's length or as a convener or as a funder. Because my sense is that a lot of coalitions fail because of lack of resources and the ability to sustain the effort. So I'd be curious to know if you were going to write a call to action for the government, what would that contain?
Well, I'll try and be brief on my response to it is that like, this takes a lot of time, and so it's not, the reason why people are transactional is because of money, right? And so they want to go in, out, get their deliverable. This takes, has a lot more failure. It takes actually wanting to sit there for the sake of sitting there, not for getting something out of it. So it's more expensive. So yes, it needs government support, philanthropic support, and dedicated money from NGOs, donor bases. Others?
I'll just say very quickly, so coming from the United States, I'm somewhat in awe of how many coalitions it kind of exist in Canada, especially around kind of the mis and disinformation space. Because they're almost entirely lacking in the United States. And why is that? I think there's a certain amount of, in the United States, the government support tends to go towards innovation. There's a huge priority towards innovation, not necessarily towards coalition building or achieving particular goals. And so I think it is absolutely essential for governments to prioritize coalition building in order to reach certain goals, but recognize that that might come at certain trade-offs. And in my opinion, the trade-off of perhaps a little less innovation and a little bit more kind of reaching the goals is worth it.
Agree greatly with both of those perspectives. I also am, and you don't have to tell me this, but I'm wondering if you or the folks with whom you work in government have similar models or ideas around like a subversive participation in coalition. Thinking back to what you were saying, Michael, about how a whole bunch of people showed up in the coalition pretending it was a climate gathering, but really knowing that they had to be a part of a tech gathering. And that's not the only coalition space in which I have seen people kind of be like, yeah, my boss doesn't really know what this actually is. And so I'm wondering if there are similar models for government workers, if there are people who have been a little bit subversive in being able to participate and then to be able to be a part of that ongoing, like I was mentioning, monitoring and evaluation of like, the best way to find out if you can meet your goal, at least in my experience, has been to talk to somebody in government who can give you the insider info about like what's going to be an achievable milestone. And so I'm wondering if there is kind of a place for that kind of conversation that might happen during the break times and not necessarily in this recorded session. But yeah, I think that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Last comment?
Yeah, I think where government's involved, where what's worked out really well in the past is where we have sort of bring together people that have something to say and contribute under sort of Chatham House rules, and the output of that particular coalition is some sort of white paper that folks in the government can speak their piece. And contribute meaningfully, but don't necessarily be named out of that. But then it's reflected, and then on a white paper or a document of some sort that then can be passed around freely within the government and forms sort of public policy. And of course, funding comes with that as well. But in terms of some of the stuff funded by the government in terms of coalitions, that's all well and good. But there needs to be some sort of output after a certain period, which keeps everyone honest and on point.
So please join me in thanking this great panel on building multi-sectoral coalitions. I don't think yet we've had a session that hasn't treated the themes of trust and accountability, but I like how this panel really got into some techniques that we can learn from. Deep cultural work, I like that, how you actually build that trust through a culture. Then some of the techniques in terms of motivational interviewing, in terms of canvassing, how you can actually use that to create those feelings of trust and belonging. I think the common language issue is one also that has started to permeate through our different sessions. And it's coming up in two ways, I'm finding. One is making sure that we have a common language to identify what we're talking about. And this is especially on the mis and disinformation side of this coalition. Like when we're talking about threats, when we're talking about narratives, to make sure that we have a common language that we can use across organizations, across nations, so that we can come together more readily. And I know we'll be coming back to that theme, especially tomorrow in our solutions workshop. There's a couple of models that will be brought through on that side. But that's something that we should also bring into our approaches to mis and disinformation as well, on the strategic communications approach, going back, using similar language, similar concepts. So again, we're developing that kind of mitigation playbook that can work across different disciplines, but also be tailored for specific circumstances. So I want to thank you for bringing out those and many other rich observations from this session. So thank you again.